Some of you think your silence did nothing. You think they moved on. You think they forgot you. You think they're perfectly fine, while you were the only one carrying the emotional weight of what happened. But God says something very different is happening beneath the surface, because some people only understand your value once they lose access to your presence. And what's breaking them right now isn't your anger, it isn't revenge, it isn't another argument, it's your absence. It's the fact that the version of you they thought would always remain available finally detached. And whether they admit it publicly or not, your silence forced them to confront parts of themselves they spent a long time avoiding. This message is not for everybody. This is for the person who stopped begging, stopped chasing, stopped over explaining, and quietly walked away to protect their peace. God says they pretend they're fine, but your absence is breaking the ego they used to hide behind. There's something people rarely talk about when it comes to relationships, connections, and emotional attachments. Some individuals become so comfortable with your presence that they start treating your love like a permanent resource. They assume you'll always forgive, you'll always understand, you will always return, and you'll always chase. And once somebody becomes emotionally convinced that you will never leave, they slowly stop valuing your emotional labor properly. Not always because they hate you, not always because they planned to hurt you. Sometimes people become careless with what feels permanently available. That's why your silence shocked them, because for the first time they encountered consequences they could actually feel. Not loud consequences, silent ones. And silent consequences are often the most painful because they force people to sit alone with themselves. No distractions, no reassurance, no emotional access, no control, just reflection. And the reflection becomes uncomfortable when somebody spent years avoiding themselves internally. God says some people only begin self examining after losing access to what emotionally stabilized them. That's why your absence feels heavier than your words ever did, because words can be ignored, but absence must be experienced. God says He had to separate you emotionally before He separated you physically, because some of you stayed loyal long after your spirit became exhausted. You kept showing up while secretly breaking inside. You kept pouring into people who only appreciated your value during moments they needed emotional comfort. And many of you confused being needed with being loved. There's a difference between someone loving your soul and someone depending on your emotional availability. Some people did not love you properly. They loved what your presence did for them emotionally. You calmed them, you reassured them, you softened difficult moments in their life. You became their emotional refugee. But when it came time to protect your heart, they became inconsistent, detached, selfish, unavailable. And God says this season of silence was not punishment, it was protection. Because heaven saw how much of yourself you were abandoning, trying to maintain connections that were draining your spirit. Some of you were losing confidence, losing peace, losing identity, trying to keep people comfortable. And God says, enough. The reason your absence is affecting them so deeply is because your energy carried more peace than they realized while they had access to you. People often fail to recognize emotional safety until it disappears. While you were there, they focused on your flaws, your reactions, your emotions, your boundaries. But once you became unavailable, the atmosphere changed. Now they notice the silence. Now they notice the emptiness. Now they notice the emotional stability you quietly brought into their life every single day. And ego hates delayed realization because ego wants to believe I can replace this. I don't care. I have moved on. You know what? I will find better. But deep down, their spirit knows something shifted. That's why some people suddenly begin watching you silently, checking your pages, asking about you indirectly, replaying old conversations at night, thinking about moments they once ignored. Not because they fully healed, but because your absence interrupted their emotional certainty. The access they once took for granted is gone, and now they are being forced to confront themselves without your comfort covering them. That's what's painful. Not just losing you, losing what you represented emotionally. God says some people were more attached to your presence than they were willing to admit because your energy gave them comfort, validation, understanding, softness, and stability. Even when they acted careless, your presence regulated parts of them emotionally. And now that you are detached, they are finally feeling the emotional weight they avoided while you were still there. This is why you must stop interpreting silence as weakness. Your silence was communication. It communicated, I respect myself enough to stop forcing what God is removing. That changes everything because healing begins the moment you stop chasing closure from people who benefited from your confusion. And some of you need to hear this carefully. Not everybody misses you because they changed. Some people miss access. Some people miss comfort. Some people miss control. And some people miss the emotional security you provided, while they gave very little in return. That is why discernment matters, because loneliness can imitate repentance. Just because somebody returns does not mean they transformed. God says, do not allow temporary emotions to reconnect you to permanent dysfunction. Watch patterns, watch consistency, watch humility. Real change does not only sound emotional, real change behaves differently. Some people know exactly what to say when they feel your energy slipping away. But words without transformation becomes another cycle. And God says some of you are no longer being called to recycle painful cycles. You are being called to evolve beyond them. You cannot heal while continuously returning to environments that wounded your spirit. Some of you secretly questioned your worth because of how this person treated you. But hear this clearly. The way somebody mishandled you is not proof of your lack of value. Sometimes people mishandle good things because they lack emotional maturity. And immature people often recognize value in reverse through absence, through loss, and through regret. That's why your silence became a mirror, because once your energy disappeared, they had fewer distractions, protecting them from self reflection. Now they must confront their pride, their inconsistency, their selfishness, their emotional immaturity. And God says this confrontation is uncomfortable for them, even if they never admit it publicly, because pride struggles to apologize to what it underestimated, especially when the other person stopped chasing. But let me say something important here. Do not let this message fill you with arrogance. This is not about revenge. This is about understanding your value without needing somebody else's suffering to validate it. Because healing is not, they finally miss me. No. Healing is, I no longer need their recognition to know my worth. That is freedom. And many of you are entering a season where your emotional energy will no longer be available to people who only appreciate you after losing you. God is teaching you to stop abandoning yourself in order to avoid being abandoned by others. God is teaching you to stop abandoning yourself in order to avoid being abandoned by others. Some of you abandoned yourselves, trying to avoid abandonment from others. And God says that cycle ends here. Your silence was not weakness, it was wisdom. Because not every battle is won through confrontation. Some battles are won through detachment, through boundaries, through emotional discipline, through finally choosing peace over emotional chaos. And what's disturbing them now is realizing that the version of you they thought would always wait finally chose peace. That changes the psychological dynamic completely because your absence removed the illusion of unlimited access. Now they understand. You can leave, you can heal, you can detach, and you can evolve without them. And ego struggles when it no longer feels emotionally powerful over someone. That's why your peace unsettles them. Not because you became cruel, but because you stopped emotionally volunteering for pain. God says continue protecting your peace in this season. Do not rush backwards just because somebody suddenly feels the consequences of losing access to you. Time reveals motives. Consistency reveals character. Distance reveals truth. Some people only discover the value of water after the well runs dry. But your responsibility now is not to emotionally rescue everybody who finally became thirsty. Your responsibility is healing. Your responsibility is growth. Your responsibility is becoming emotionally whole again. And God says the version of you being rebuilt in this season will no longer beg for love that requires self betrayal to maintain, because what's ahead of you requires stronger discernment, stronger boundaries, deeper self respect, and greater emotional wisdom. This season is not destroying you, it is rebuilding you quietly, internally, spiritually, and emotionally. And one day, you will thank God for the silence that taught you how to choose yourself again. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that got through to the person that needed it. You'll have a great day.